Welcome to Getting Connected, a video overview of how to allow outside users to connect to your Rumpus server. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how to set up your server's TCP/IP access and airport router. Before we get started, it's important to understand what's really going on. Think about your computer network the same way you might think about the phone system in a typical office. In an office, there might be a lot of people with phones on their desks, all of whom can make outbound calls whenever they like. When someone from the outside world calls the office, they dial the one phone number shared by the entire office, and a receptionist answers the phone, asks who the person is trying to reach, and directs the call to the correct extension. Most modern networks work in exactly this same way. Any computer on the network can make outbound connections, all of which are routed through the shared internet connection. And when someone from the outside world makes a connection to your LAN, some process is needed to direct them to your Rumpus server. In this analogy, your router is the receptionist, and what we'll be doing is telling the router which computer on your network should receive incoming calls. To start, we'll launch the Airport Utility application that was included with the Airport Extreme router. The Airport Utility has changed through different versions, so your setup process may look a little different from what I'm about to demonstrate. The basic job, however, is very similar. Once the Airport Utility is started, I'll click Manual Setup to access the full range of setup options available on the router. One task your airport router performs is assigning local IP addresses for computers on the local network. This process is called DHCP and allows computers on the LAN to configure themselves with the help of the airport. Using DHCP, each computer on the LAN is dynamically assigned an address from an available pool of addresses managed by the router. In an office, if the telephone extensions to each desk were always changing, it would be impossible for a receptionist to reach people reliably. The same goes for your LAN, so the first thing you'll need to do is make sure that your Rumpus server's local IP address never changes. If we check the DHCP settings for the airport on my test network, we see that the pool of addresses used is 10.0.1.2 to 10.0.1.200. We'll need to choose an IP address outside of that pool for the server to avoid conflicting with addresses assigned by the router. To configure the server with a static address, open the Network System Preferences panel. TCP/IP should be configured either manually or by DHCP with a manual address. In this example, we'll use DHCP with a manual address, so that DHCP will take care of everything except the address, and I'll choose 10.0.1.201 for the server. Again, this is only an example. As long as your server has a static and unique address on the LAN, you're ready to move on to the next step. If your Rumpus server is the only computer on your network that outside users will need to access, the rest of the setup is easy, since the airport can just redirect every request to the Rumpus server. On the NAT tab, simply check the Enable Default Host option and supply the Rumpus server's internal address. After clicking Update, outside users will automatically be directed to the Rumpus server for any request they make. If you choose this option, click Update and have someone from outside your network try to access your Rumpus server using a web browser or FTP client by connecting to your external network address. Once you've confirmed that outside users can connect, the job is done and your server is ready to handle file transfers for anyone on the internet. If you have other computers on your LAN that outside users may need to connect to for any reason, or if you prefer that only the specific ports needed for Rumpus access are allowed, the setup is a little more involved and is called port mapping. Configuring port mapping is performed using the advanced settings on the Port Mapping tab. To add my first port mapping, I'll click the Add button. It's usually best to start with web access setup, since the web protocol is simpler from a networking perspective than FTP. UDP isn't used for web or FTP access, so we'll skip that field, and then choose the Rumpus web server port as the public TCP port. Next, I'll supply my server's static IP address on the private LAN, and then the Rumpus web port number as the private TCP port. In all of the port mapping setup, it's usually best to have the public port number and the private port number be the same for simplicity. In this case, for example, outside users will be making connections to my router on the web default port of 80, and those connections will be routed back to the Rumpus server on that same port. Finally, I'm asked to provide a description of this port mapping. I'll enter WFM forwarding, but you can enter anything that will identify the setting. With the web port mapping defined, click Update, and then have someone from outside your LAN start a web browser and attempt to connect to your public IP address. When they do, they should be presented with the Rumpus login page, just as you are when connecting to your Rumpus server from inside your network. If outside users still can't connect, review your settings and, if needed, send email to Maxim Technical Support for help. Once web access is working properly, you'll probably want to enable FTP access too. Add another port mapping entry, and this time set the TCP ports to 21 and the range 3000 through 3008. These are the default FTP ports used by Rumpus, though they are configurable. Be sure to check the Network Setup window in Rumpus for a complete list of the ports that need to be mapped. The private address will again be set to the LAN address of your server, and again, we'll map the ports straight through to the same ports on the LAN. This time, we'll set the description to FTP forwarding so that we can recognize this setup in the future. That's it. The router setup is complete, and once the router has been updated, outside users will be able to connect via either web or FTP. Note that the airport router does not perform automatic FTP address translation, so be sure to open the Network Setup window in Rumpus and enter your external Internet IP address in the network address field. As always, if you have trouble, or if you simply need someone from outside your LAN to test your setup, send mail to support@maxim.com. We'll be happy to help you make sure your server is publicly accessible and working perfectly.